In conclusion, finally, therefore, you give the reader a sense that now I am concluding my what? My essay. So that will be the conclusion of that essay. Now let's come to yet another example. Now this is question 4 of paper 1, China. It says Mao's policies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. And what is our question verb? Our question verb is, do you agree with the statement? Now use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. Now, you're going to have to use relevant evidence to support the standpoint that we have taken. For instance, if you say, yes, I agree, you're going to have to use relevant evidence to support what we have, the standpoint that we have taken, that you agree that the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. If you say, no, I disagree, again, you are still required to take relevant evidence or to use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. Now, what must the learner do in the example that we have just given? You use relevant evidence to argue that Mao's policies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. You use relevant evidence to argue that Mao's policies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. Now let's look at the 3 most important steps. Step number 1, you have to take a standpoint, a stance, and refer to the question to agree or to disagree with the statement. Step number 2, you give the reason or the reasons why you agree or disagree with the statement. The last step, step number 3, orientation, you provide historical evidence. You show why I disagree or why I agree with my standpoint. Now, your conclusion. In your conclusion, you simply wrap up the essay. You can say in the conclusion, like I have said in the beginning, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution had failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. I have given a body of evidence to show it failed because of this and this and this. So no new evidence or points should be included in the conclusion. You begin with a concluding statement. Make reference to the question. You sum up or you draw together the main points that you have to make. Then you turn the introduction into a conclusion. What this simply means is that your conclusion must have a direct link with what? With your introduction. In other words, the conclusion cannot differ from your what? Your introduction. There must be that link between your introduction and your what? And your conclusion. Now, we continue. Mao's policies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. Sorry. Do you agree with the statement? Use relevant evidence to support your line of argument. So you can say, therefore, one can conclude that Mao's policies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. Or you can simply say, yes, I agree. The 2 policies of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution failed indeed to transform China into a modern industrial state. Why? Because it led to a period of political and social turmoil, which undermined the Communist Party's goal of creating a modern industrialized state. Now, this essay is going to examine Mao's Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, as China was drawn into the fray of the Cold War. Now let's look at the introduction and the conclusion. Number one can agree with this statement. That will be your standpoint in the what? In the introduction. It can be argued that Mao's policies of the Great Leap Forward, which include activities such as backyard factories and communes, and the Cultural Revolution, with activities like the Red Guards and the elimination of the intellectuals, indeed failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. Why? Because it led to a period of political and social turmoil, which undermined the Communist Party's goal of creating a modern industrialized state. Now, in your conclusion, you will say, therefore one can conclude, or conclusively, or I conclude therefore that, or finally, Mao's policies of the Great Leap Forward, such as backyard factories and communes, and the Cultural Revolution, such as the activities of the Red Guards and the elimination of intellectuals, failed to transform China into a modern industrial state. Why? Because it led to a period of political and social turmoil, which undermined the Communist Party's goal of creating a modern industrialized state. Now, that is all what I wanted to talk about concerning how you tackle your essays. Remember, finally, I said, learners, when you write your essay, there are three most important steps that you have to follow. Number one, no essay is complete if it does not have a what? An introduction. Let's make an example of a house. Your introduction will be like a what? A foundation. No house can be built without a what? Without a foundation. So your introduction is like a what? The foundation of a house. And in this case, we said an introduction can also include the what? The standpoint. But the standpoint only in the case where you have been required to take a standpoint. Like in the case of, do you agree? Explain to what extent? And if the question says, explain to what extent, what do? You say, to a greater extent. To a greater extent is equivalent to, I agree. But if you say, to a lesser extent, it is equivalent to, I do not agree. So you must be very vigilant. If the question says, explain to what extent, it's like, do you agree? Now, as I have said, in that case, we have to say to a greater extent or to a lesser extent. To a lesser extent, if you don't agree. To a greater extent, if you agree. Now, as I have said, a complete and a perfect essay will start with an introduction. An introduction will have a standpoint in the case where you are required to take a standpoint. It will also have a body which will require you to write paragraphs which will follow the what? The peel method. And the body should also follow a coherent and a chronological line of argument. And finally, your essay should end up with a what? With a conclusion. In other words, you don't just write without doing what? Without giving us your conclusion. How do you conclude your essay? What is your point? How do you convince us what we have discussed about is correct? So that will be your what? That will be your conclusion. So this is all that I wanted to discuss with you, learners. Learners, I wish you success in all of your efforts and endeavors in this upcoming exam. I am quite certain that when you tackle essays, you'll follow all these three steps that I've discussed. And I'm quite certain that if you follow all those three steps, then you'll never go wrong. You'll never go wrong. Your essay will garner as much marks as possible. I thank you. Thank you very much.